Welcome. We'll get started in a few minutes. While we wait, feel free to use the chat to tell us where you're tuning in from and any questions you hope to have answered or anything you hope to learn. Okay, we're going to get started. Um, Hello and welcome to the Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Ryan Tipping. I go by he, him pronouns. I'm the Director of Campaigns and Strategy at Maine Center for Economic Policy and MECEP Action. Today, I'm joined by Karen Luthi, Josie Phillips, Arthur Phillips, and James Mile, who are all going to be chiming in along the way to talk about specific bills that we're following this session. Maine Center for Economic Policy is an independent, nonpartisan research and policy organization working to advance equity and prosperity for all Maine people. That means advocating for fairer tax policies, for access to education, healthcare, and livable wage jobs, and for investments in government programs and services Maine people rely on. We do this largely through policy research, issue framing, and legislative advocacy. Maine Center for Economic Policy acknowledges the land sharing and extending beyond Maine's borders is occupied Wabanaki homeland. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations and work to build durable relationships with Wabanaki communities that respect tribal authority, culture, and traditions, and advance the cause of economic justice. We'll touch on tribal sovereignty more in a minute, but we're here today to talk about the legislative session. Just a quick housekeeping thing. I'm going to speak a little bit at the beginning about corporate transparency and the work we're doing around that, and then pull colleagues in along the way to speak about individual bills. Feel free throughout the entire presentation to drop questions in the chat, and we'll hopefully have time to take them at the end. So MECEP's legislative priorities in 2024 aim to advance economic justice and racial equity. We want to bring fairness and accountability to the corporate tax code, ensure Maine workers have greater protections and opportunities on the job, bolster supports for families that allow them to balance work and caregiving, create more affordable housing and healthcare, and build a budget that helps people and communities that need it the most. The budget is an incredibly important bill, the supplemental budget in this particular legislative session. We believe in creating a budget that's a moral document that shows what we care about as a community. And we're going to spend a lot of time during legislative session working on that. But for this webinar, we're going to focus on other individual bills, some of which may have components within the budget, but most of which are standalone. We're going to start with corporate accountability. We know that when corporations pay what they owe, Maine looks like a state that prospers. It means our people, communities, and small businesses have ample resources and a level playing field to prosper. One bill that we're following that attempts to achieve this aim is the Corporate Income Tax Transparency Bill, LD 1337, which is put forward by Representative Ann Matlack. By taking advantage of tax loopholes and accounting schemes, wealthy corporations rig the rules. They refuse to contribute their fair share with armies of accountants and lawyers, and the result is fewer dollars flowing into our communities and helping everyday Mainers. Due to lack of transparency and data, Mainers can't know how much of these large, publicly traded, a lot of times multinational corporations, how much they contribute to Maine through taxes, or in some cases, take from us in tax breaks. But at the federal level, we have data that clearly shows corporations are avoiding paying their taxes on a massive scale. some major household names pay nothing or next to nothing. We have no state level data to know what is happening in Maine. So it's time to shine a light on corporate tax avoidance and find out whether or not corporations are paying what they owe. This bill, 1337, is going to help us understand whether our tax system is functioning the way we intend and what corporations are contributing. The bill would create a requirement for annual public filing of certain information by publicly traded corporations, including information on state income taxes, how much they paid, and the state subsidies that they received. The bill's currently in the Taxation Committee. Our analyst, Maura Pillsbury, is leading the charge on it. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us today, but if you're more interested in that, feel free to reach out and we can connect you. Another item in corporate accountability realm is a bill about the abuse of dominance, sponsored by Representative Rebecca Millett. It was recently voted out of the IDEA committee. Unfortunately, largely gutted from what we wanted to see happen with the bill, but the proposal would give our state more resources to stop companies from abusing their monopolies to raise prices and push small businesses out of the way. We hope to keep working on that issue as well. So that's one aspect of our work, trying to shine more light on corporate America and the tactics they use and the way they rig our tax code. But another thing we want to look at in policy is how do we support Maine workers? James, do you want to tell us a little bit about a few bills that you're following?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So we know that the strong labor market over the past few years and the recovery from the recession has really given workers a large number of gains, even after accounting for the high level of inflation. You know, we see for workers in service industries, for example, in particular, we've seen above inflation rates of wage gains and some improvements in working conditions. But we also know that we need to cement those wins and to make sure the workers continue to get a fair shake in this economy. So there are several bills that we're watching. There's about 4 or 5 that were passed and are on the appropriations table right now that are waiting for small amounts of enforcement money. And these would all help make the workplace fairer in one way or another, but I wanted to highlight a couple of them. One of them is LD 936, that's from Representative Amy Rader, and that would require the disclosure of wage and salary ranges on job advertisements. We think that would really help it would improve worker bargaining power, set a more level playing field so the employer doesn't hold all the cards when it comes to setting how much people are earning once they apply for a job. But it also would importantly make it harder for employers to lowball women and people of color, which we know are practices that happen and help to make the wage gaps in several industries worse. Another bill in that situation that's on the table is LD 1190. That's from Senator Mike Tipping. That would require something called reporting pay. So that if you're called into work by your employer, but then you're sent home before your shift begins because your employer has overscheduled for that shift, the employer would still have to pay you 2 hours worth of wages as a way of compensating you for your time and making sure that you're not being called in unnecessarily. And then finally, we're continuing to push. We've been on a multi-year push right now, but we've been continuing to push for an expansion of overtime protections. The bill this year is called LD 513. That's also from Senator Tipping. That's in the Labor and Housing Committee right now. And that would potentially create extra protections for thousands more low-paid Mainers who are earning a salary and making sure that they're automatically eligible for overtime pay. So if they work more than 40 hours a week, they're getting the extra compensation that deserves.
Those all sound like really important protections that we hope to see passed. Thanks for paying attention to those and advocating for them, James. Arthur, do you want to talk a little bit about how we support workers in a different way?
Yeah, sure. So I think as most people watching or listening today know, it's really hard to find childcare basically anywhere you are in the state. It's especially hard in more rural areas. It's also very expensive, and that puts tremendous pressure on families with young children. It also has really significant impacts on women who primarily are those that put a pause on their working life or their careers to take care of young ones when they can't find care, which obviously significantly impacts their earnings and their retirement savings for the long term. So last session, there was some really tremendous advances in this area. It was led by a push from Senate President Troy Jackson, who introduced a bill that was most of which was passed in the budget that ended up doubling wage supplements for childcare workers, who are among our lowest paid workers in the economy, despite the incredible work that they do to support all of us and allow many other workers stay in the labor force. It also significantly expanded subsidies to help families pay for the cost of childcare. But not all of that bill was passed in the budget. There's still more left to go. So that's why this session, Senate President Jackson introduced LD 2199. This was the missing piece from last session that did not get funded. And primarily, it is about improving the subsidy program to make sure that childcare providers who are caring for and educating children whose families are receiving those subsidies get properly reimbursed by the state, which makes sure that they can keep their doors open and serving families and children. So that bill, again, LD 2199, will have its first public hearing in the Health and Human Services Committee on Tuesday, February 20th.
Great. Thanks, Arthur. So another part of the workforce that we've been tracking and working with some partner organizations on is the direct care workforce. And despite progress in recent years, direct care workers who provide skilled supports and services to older and disabled Mainers and those with behavioral health needs remain deeply undervalued. Josie, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the legislation we're following on that front?
Yeah, sure. So because we've been undervaluing direct care workers for so long, we are facing an acute shortage of these workers across our state. And this shortage is hurting the health of our loved ones, as well as the strength of our overall economy. So the bill we're tracking this session that would help address that is LD 1718, sponsored by Representative Meyer and currently sitting on the special appropriations table. This bill would help to attract and retain workers within this field by offering them a $4,000 tuition credit, which could be applied at any institution within the Maine system. And something that is particularly noteworthy about this bill is that this credit could be used by the direct care workers themselves, as well as their immediate family members. And so this is particularly important for racial justice because we know that this workforce is disproportionately immigrants and people of color. So offering a benefit that can be intergenerational, can help both to provide immediate stability to that direct care worker, as well as help to, in the long term, address some of the racial wealth disparity that we see in this country.
Great. Another area that we're watching is how we treat public servants. We know that public servants are foundational for our communities, from teachers that ensure our children have a clear and prosperous future to, the workers who plow the roads during a snowstorm. Arthur, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the bills that honor those folks?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So yeah, we'll touch on a few different things here. So first, let's talk about state workers. So these are the public servants who provide critical services to our states, like Ryan said, plowing our roads, child protection services, public health nursing, and the people who administer our safety net programs. But for years, these folks have been facing a significant pay gap when we compare their compensation to similarly positioned workers in the economy, both in the private sector here in Maine and public sector workers in neighboring states in New England. So these workers have, through their union bargaining, they have won raises in recent contract negotiations that have helped. But obviously, with the rising cost of living, with inflation, and the wage gains that private sector workers have seen in recent years, they need much more in terms of wage gains to be able to keep up with other workers and try to attempt to close that wage gap that we know still exists. That's critical for retaining the public servants that we have now and attracting more people into the field because there are really significant shortages in this in this sector overall. I think the job vacancy right now is about 16%, which is significantly higher than the normal rate. So Representative Drew Gattine has introduced LD 2121, which actually has a hearing tomorrow afternoon, which we'll be testifying in. And the purpose of that would be to appropriate the necessary funds from our state surplus to make sure that we're paying our public servants enough to begin to close that wage gap. So that's kind of one bucket of public sector workers who we're really focused on this session. Next, let's talk about teachers and support staff in our public schools. They're also facing significant staffing shortages among teachers, ed techs, bus drivers, and other roles. Meanwhile, hundreds of educators are approaching retirement age, so we're kind of looking down the road a few years and anticipating that there's a lot more teachers that we're going to have to replace. But we have the resources and the tools to address these issues, but we need the political will to really invest in our educators and our education. So last session, Senator Teresa Peirce introduced LD 1064, which would gradually, over the course of the next 4 years, raise the minimum teacher salary to $50,000. Again, that would be, if it were passed and funded, that would take 4 years to get the minimum salary to $50,000. Meanwhile, Representative Ed Crockett introduced LD 974, which would set a minimum wage for support staff, which would simply be at 133% of the statewide minimum wage. As you may know, our statewide minimum wage is thankfully pegged to inflation, so that gets adjusted each year depending on the rise in the cost of living. Both of these bills are really critical to filling vacancies, replacing folks who are going to retire in coming years, and fundamentally are about ensuring that our students receive the education they deserve. So lastly, on this piece, I just want to talk about public higher education and the costs of attending public university. So I think a lot of people are aware that student debt has exploded in recent decades. Fundamentally, this is about the cost of higher education falling increasingly on students and their families, while less and less of the costs of higher education are paid by the state. Now, the state has made some improvements in this area, both by managing helping deal with the student debt through the student loan repayment tax credit, and also by making community college free for recent high school graduates, which is a really fantastic change that our state made in recent years. But what we haven't done is addressed the cost that students and families have to pay to attend public universities in the state of Maine. So that's where Senator Mike Tipping's bill LD 512 comes in. And this would create a tuition waiver, which would effectively cover the difference between the cost of tuition and the amount of a Pell Grant for eligible full-time students. So this would kind of balance because the cost of community college has been essentially made free for recent grads, this would try to kind of balance that out so that we have some parity between when we think about the cost of public universities and public colleges. And I think I'll leave it there on this segment.
Great. I just want to put it out there for full disclosure. We talked about a few bills that Senator Tipping is working on. In addition to being my senator, he's also my brother. So wanted to fully disclose that. But we can't talk about economic justice and racial equity without talking about one bill that was a really hard fight last year. And we hope we'll see some success on next year, which is farm workers. For nearly a century, farm workers in Maine have been explicitly excluded for some of the most basic labor laws, including minimum wage. And it's a legacy rooted in racism that today means agricultural workers are far more likely to live in poverty. The people who power our agricultural economy and feed our families deserve the same rights as everyone else. Do you want to say a little bit about what's ahead for this session, Arthur?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So just a little bit on background. Last session, Speaker Rachel Talbot Ross introduced a couple of bills, one of which was LD 398, which would have ensured that farm workers, like all other workers, are covered under the statewide minimum wage. As Ryan said, going back nearly a century, workers have been cut out of federal labor law that has them covered under wage and hour laws, and excludes them from the right to collectively organize and collectively bargain. So those are some of the historical wrongs that we really feel need to be changed in the state of Maine, as they have been in several states across the country. As Ryan said, farm workers are disproportionately people of color, and they are more than 4 times likely to live in poverty than other workers in our economy. So last session's Bill 398 was unfortunately, it was passed by both houses of the legislature. It was unfortunately vetoed by Governor Mills. But Governor Mills established a committee to deliberate further on the issue and to make recommendations for her to introduce a minimum wage bill in this session. We expect that report, the official report from that committee's work, to be delivered to the governor, and for the governor to introduce some kind of a minimum wage bill in the coming weeks. We want to make sure that that is the strongest minimum wage bill possible and does not make other carve-outs or exceptions for farm workers, as have been made for farm workers for many, many decades now. I also want to mention that there was a bill last session also introduced by Speaker Talbot Ross, LD 525, which would get at the issue of farm workers being excluded from collective bargaining rights. LD 525 would grant workers the right to collectively bargain and to unionize and collectively bargain, and to work together to address the issues that they face as workers. That bill was carried over last session after having a hearing in the Labor and Housing Committee, and we look forward to advocating for its passage in the current session.
Great. Thanks for giving us those roundups, Arthur. Another foundational piece that ensures people have the ability to live healthy lives and participate in our society is a strong healthcare system. James, you want to tell us about a couple bills that are for the legislature this year?
Yeah, so healthcare and access to affordable healthcare is one of the foundational pieces of work that we do here at MECEP. It can vary from year to year exactly sort of which bills are being introduced and looked at, but it is kind of a through line, as it is a kind of continuing concern for a lot of the folks that we advocate on behalf of. So as usual, we're working with partners, especially folks like Consumers for Affordable Healthcare, also other groups like Maine Equal Justice, who are working to expand access to affordable care. A couple of the bills that we're looking at this session, one, LD 1955 in the Health and Human Services Committee, is from Speaker Talbot Ross. And that would make it, that already had its public hearing, but I think has not been voted out of committee yet. It would make it easier for Mainers to get access to free care at hospitals by standardizing the procedure, and by making all hospitals adhere to kind of the same standards of how they offer free care. Because right now the process is very confusing, even though it's supposed to be part of hospitals' kind of charitable mandate, it doesn't always get provided in the same way that it should. We're also looking at LD 2174, which is from Senate President Troy Jackson. That would regulate medical credit cards, which is a relatively new innovation that we're seeing in Maine. Those can be ways that can unfortunately end up trapping patients into high debt payment plans. And that's waiting for a public hearing in the Health Care, Insurance and Financial Services Committee. So that's one we'll be looking at. And then we're also monitoring some general efforts. There was a commission over the summer to look at the idea of a public option in the state of Maine. There are things like the implementation of the paid family medical leave program, which was a big win from last year. And we'll be continuing to push for things like full immigrant inclusion in Maine care, and the ending of other kind of unfair exclusions that disproportionately impact people of color in the state.
Great. Thanks, James. So I hope people have had a chance to check out the State of Working Maine that came out the end of last year. James was the primary author on. One of the stories that we heard again and again from the interviews that Karen did with folks was housing is incredibly important to almost every aspect of the economy and people's lives. And I think we all recognize that it's a major issue in Maine. Josie, do you want to tell us a little bit about what bills we're looking at in this session to address the shortage and make sure people have homes?
Yeah, so we know that as a state, we have our work cut out for us when it comes to addressing the affordable housing crisis. We need to construct roughly 80,000 units of additional housing by 2030 to meet the demand for our population and economy. So when considering how to address the affordable housing crisis, we need to take a long-term and a short-term approach to it. In the long term, we're focusing on things like making it easier to build housing. For instance, LD 1672, sponsored by Representative Geer and currently sitting in the Housing Committee, would establish a state review board for affordable housing projects, which would help to streamline the process and decrease the amount of time between project planning and getting the actual housing built and on the ground. So that's how we make it easier to build housing. We also, though, need to directly invest in affordable housing production. And this is something that LD 226, sponsored by Representative Millett and sitting on the special appropriations table, would accomplish. It would invest $40 million per year over 4 years in affordable housing production. So that's the long-term view. But we also know that people are struggling to stay housed now. Almost half of Maine renters are cost burdened, which means they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And we know that eviction rates are increasing, as is homelessness. So we need immediate relief now while these long-term strategies come to fruition. And so what that's going to look like is going to be rental assistance. And there are 2 bills this session that would do that, LD 1710 and 1540. They each have slight differences between them, but in effect, they would both provide immediate financial assistance to renters who have very low incomes and are struggling to stay housed.
Great. Thanks for following those bills, Josie. I know there was a lot, and it's a focus of the legislature, the Joint Select Committee that they formed last year. It's still hard at work there. So changing tack a little bit, we want to talk about tribal sovereignty. Maine Center for Economic Policy stands with the Wabanaki Nations and their call to reform the 1980 Indian Claims Settlement Act and the companion Maine Implementing Act, which limit inherent rights to self-govern. When the Wabanaki Nations have the tools they need to thrive, we know that all who live within Maine's borders will benefit. Karen, do you want to tell us a little bit about what that fight looks like this session?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So we are a proud and active member of the Wabanaki Alliance Tribal Coalition, and through that alliance, we have been monitoring and supporting a number of different bills over the past few years. And the good news is that there is more support for restoring tribal sovereignty to the Wabanaki Nations than there ever has been before. And the bad news is that we just are still falling short on passing legislation that would get at it. So back in 2020, a bipartisan task force issued 22 consensus recommendations for how to update and change the implementing acts to restore sovereignty and self-governance in a number of different areas, including criminal justice and hunting and fishing rights, and how the state communicates with the tribal nations, a lot of different things. And those recommendations have been included in a number of legislative vehicles over the years. So in the first half of this session, we saw that as LD 2004, and that's the one that got bipartisan supermajority to pass. And it was really, really exciting, but then it got vetoed by the governor and some of that support dropped off after that. And we weren't able to override that veto. So the current state of affairs is that the next vehicle will be LD 2007, and it is still in concept draft form, so we don't have the final language on it, but it does have the full cohort of co-sponsors, which shows that there is still very strong bipartisan support for getting something done. So we aren't sure if it is going to take the same kind of broad approach that other bills have done, which is, all of the consensus recommendations, or if it's going to bite off a chunk of those that are focused on specific areas. We're not sure yet, but we will keep folks updated. And we also recently put out a tribal sovereignty explainer that looks in particular at the economic benefit of restoring sovereignty and self-governance. And we will keep that updated as well with the with what's happening with LD 2007. So, and that's also like 2004, sponsored by Rachel Talbot Ross, speaker, who has been such a champion on this issue, and we're really excited about it. Fingers crossed.
Great. We appreciate everyone sticking with us. I think we just did like, I don't know, 6 or 7 different committees around the State House and a whole bunch of different bills. Pretty rapid fire. We appreciate everyone sticking around. We're going to dig into some questions now, but before we do that, I just want to say you can check our website and our various social media for progress on these issues and actions at key times. Speaking of which, there's one action you can take today, telling the legislature, don't leave Mainers in the cold. There's an Action Network petition you can sign, and we'll post the link in the chat. So jumping to questions, if you still have time to throw them in the chat, we have a little over 10 minutes left, so feel free to drop them. But first, we're going to start with a question on our position on Mills's plan to store away hundreds of millions of dollars and how else that money might be spent. Again, we didn't really get into the budget much this session, and we're going to put out a lot more information about it once the actual budget document drops. But Josie, do you want to respond to the question of whether or not we should squirrel away $100 million right now?
Sure. So I think about this through 2 ways. One being the fiscal position that the state is currently in. We are currently in a very strong fiscal position. Revenue is anticipated to grow over the coming years. And additionally, our rainy day fund is statutorily full. So we are already at a maximum savings here. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to squirrel away even more on top of that, in my opinion. And then also, I think it is only fiscally prudent to save money whenever all your bills are paid. If you have more things that need to be addressed, if your electricity is at risk of being shut off, it doesn't necessarily make sense to keep, as you said, squirreling away. And what we're seeing is that there's a number of unmet needs that are pressing in Maine. So for instance, for my issue area, housing, we need to roughly double the rate at which we're producing housing in order to meet that goal of 80,000 units by 2030. And that's aside from the rent relief to people who are struggling to remain housed now. So until we can meet the needs of Mainers now, I don't see the reason to squirrel away a full $100 million just in case something happens in the future when we already have a full rainy day fund.
Thanks, Josie. So we had another question about specific legislative efforts to promote racial equity. I think we talked about a couple bills that have specific racial equity lenses to them. But James, do you want to talk about a bill that was voted on yesterday?
Yeah, I wanted to take a moment to let folks know about the proposal to create an Office of New Americans. It's received a little bit of attention in the press, so maybe folks have heard about it, but that's a bill that we're supporting. It fits in, the idea is that it's an office that would help, it's mostly a policy-making office. It would help to coordinate kind of some of the different programs that we have locally and in state agencies that are designed to essentially to help immigrants kind of be able to assimilate and to be able to fit in Maine and to be able to make their way in the economy. You know, we're supporting it partly because it fits in with a lot of the goals we set out in the State of Working Maine that talk about, you know, immigration as being key to bolstering our workforce, to strengthening our economy overall, and to making sure that, you know, new Mainers have the resources that they need to be able to make the most of the skills that they bring to our state, which are often many. So that got a favorable vote out of the State and Local Government Committee last night, and is hopefully heading to the chambers for a vote relatively soon.
Great, thanks, James. So we had one question about the AFA table and the appropriations table, or the table, and how does MECEP choose priorities among all these good things to urge the appropriation committee to fund? That's a really great question. Thank you, Kit. So for those who don't know, the way the Maine legislature works is bills make it out of committees and then through the floor if they're successful. Attached to them, if there's a spending part to them, is a fiscal note that details how much that bill will cost to implement. One bill kind of gets around that. It's the budget, and it's the bulk of how the state spends money. But after the budget's settled, all the bills that don't make it into the budget go to the AFA table, where whatever money is available is used to fund specific bills. It's a great question. There's a lot of competing priorities there, a lot of important ideas. And of course, it's not up to us how those decisions are made. But one of the things we focus on with the AFA members and the legislature in general is pushing back on the scarcity mindset that, we don't have the funding to do what we need to do. We know we are still hundreds of millions of dollars away from where we could be if we didn't have the LePage tax cuts that predominantly helped the wealthiest. We know there's other options, closing corporate loopholes, addressing different wealth tax mechanisms like the excise tax or the real estate transfer tax to actually increase funds, much less looking at the rainy day funds for using them now to help people for whom it's been raining for quite a while. So I think that's our big focus in terms of which priorities we lift up to make sure that they're focusing on. In a large part, that's guided by the research and the work that all of these analysts do to put together what are the biggest issues affecting the state right now. So hope that answered the question. Always good to bring in some legislative procedure to this kind of stuff. We had another question pop up. So for specifically on worker protections, how can we disseminate information about these protections to workers themselves? And someone said they've spoken with many who are unaware of the laws. Arthur, do you want to talk a little bit about that and some of the institutions in the state that are helping to work on that?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and appreciate the question, and welcome James or anyone else to jump in on this. But I think that there are proactive efforts by the Department of Labor and the Bureau of Labor Standards to get themselves in front of workers and employers to raise awareness about what the law says, so that there's more compliance on the part of employers and that there's more awareness on the part of workers to know what their rights are. There's obviously, signage in every workplace. There has to be posters to inform people of those things, but we all know that that's not sufficient. I do also want to mention that there is a bill this session which is intent on improving the enforcement of wage and hour laws. Generally speaking, these days, in recent years, as going back many years, the approach has been a reactive complaint-based approach. So if a worker comes forward and says that they feel that one of their labor rights was violated, the Bureau of Labor Standards would then react to that complaint and investigate it. There is currently a proposal, not to throw more LDs at you, but I will now. LD 2184 is a proposal to change that system to a more proactive approach, whereby the Bureau of Labor Standards would create kind of an annual strategy to focus on sectors of the economy where they believe, based on academic and other research, there's more violations of labor laws occurring, and for them to take a proactive approach so that they're not relying on workers who might be afraid to come forward and file a complaint because they fear some form of retaliation from their employer. So I think there's a lot more work that we could do to educate employers and workers. And I'm really encouraged by the new bill that's being proposed, and hope that will be passed so that the Bureau of Labor Standards can put itself in a better position to be more proactive in protecting workers.
Thanks, Arthur. James, do you have anything to add there?
Not really, only to reiterate that and say like it's been an ongoing priority, and when we've looked historically at the amount of enforcement capacity that Department of Labor has, I know our friends at the Bureau of Labor Standards would agree that we need more capacity to enforce some of those positions. So we're also pushing for more positions at the department to help with that.
Right. So we had another question digging into housing. How does the new state board streamline the process to build housing? Josie, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so we know that a massive barrier to building housing has been local opposition or NIMBYism. That's opposed not just to like housing in general, but specifically to affordable housing. And so what this bill, the State Review Board, would do is it would allow affordable housing developers to bypass the local permitting and go through a state review board if, and this is the key to it, if the local regulations are out of compliance with that municipality's comprehensive growth plan. So this bill still allows for local control as to where housing gets built, what the neighborhood character looks like. But if they're specifically throwing up barriers just for affordable housing, this helps affordable housing developers to bypass that. And this is a policy that has been pursued in similar ways across a number of other states and states, not cities. And it's seen some success. So this won't be a silver bullet to solve our affordable housing crisis, because nothing will, but we need to take a silver buckshot approach, and this is quite the promising pellet in that buckshot.
Great. So we had one question from increasing around increasing the teacher salaries to meet the 50,000 goal. Arthur, do you want to talk about how that will have an effect for other teachers who are not just joining the workforce?
Yeah, so I think that one piece I think in answering that question is that the state will, that bill does propose to make an appropriation from the general fund to the Department of Education to help pay for the increases in wages. And I think that there's an element to that there's wage compression that will happen as a part of that. So it's not just I don't think it's just those workers that fall below whatever the threshold is as we would ramp up to the $50,000 minimum in 2028. But it is not an imposition of significant financial commitment on municipalities and on school districts. There's I think the fiscal note for that I think was around $9 million investment at the state level by 2027 to help pay for the increases for salaries for teachers.
Great. Thanks. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. If you want to follow up on any of these bills, and I know we took kind of a blitz approach today to get at a whole lot of different subjects, each of which could probably have its own half-hour, 45-hour long webinar. If you want more information, you can reach out to our social medias or info@mecep.org. My email is ryan@mecep.org if you want to reach me. And this event has actually been recorded and will be shared out soon. So with that, I just want to say thank you all for taking your time to enjoy your lunch or just spend some time with us today. And please get involved. None of these bills move without people paying attention to the process and pushing the legislators to do the right thing. So thank you all very much.